Hello, everyone. We'd like to get started. First off, welcome all for attending. And before we begin, I hope you all have a fresh cup of coffee. And for questions, feel free to submit questions during the webinar. We'll answer them at the end of the session. And you can include your questions at the right side of your screen. There is a button saying questions. If you post them there, then we can cover them. We'd love to hear your feedback and your thoughts. So there's a survey at the end, and a recording of this webinar will be posted on our website later on. So let's get started. Who are we? So my name is Edwin Slangen. I'm one of the senior security specialists at Secura. I'm a team lead, and I'm also a core member of the red team. And as such, I've been involved with numerous red teams in the financial and insurance sector. And before this, I worked at the Ministry of Defense developing cyber warfare capabilities. And my colleague Ben.
Good morning. My name is Ben Brücker, and I'm at Secura for about 6 years now, and I'm also a senior security specialist, a core member of the red team. And besides the red teaming, I'm also my focus is on social engineering and mobile hacking. And I'm happy that all of you joined, and hopefully we can tell you something new about red teaming and operational technology today.
Okay, thank you. And about Secura, for those of you who don't know, our company, our slogan is providing insight into your security. We've been founded in 2000, and we have a strong team of experts. We approach security from many different angles, which translate into different branches within our company. As you can see, we have a security audit branch and we have a security testing branch. We also develop tools and we provide training and awareness sessions. And we top this off with assurance and certification. Now, before we get into the specifics, I briefly want to take you into this timeline with a list of cyber physical attacks. So here you can see Marucci, which was launched in 2000, and then the more predominantly well-known cyber physical attacks. So Stuxnet in 2010 in Iran, followed by Black Energy in 2015, Indestroyer in 2016, then Triton, then Dragonfly activities, and also many more in 2019 and 2020. Where next to nation states actors, we see that more and more different types of attackers are targeting OT systems. So the agenda for today will be what is red teaming, and we're going to cover the threat landscape, and we're going to cover the specifics in OT/RT, and how to measure real-world attack readiness and prepare effectively. And we're going to end it by a Q&A session. So let's get into it. What is red teaming? Now, to answer that question, we first need to look at the red team itself. So the red team is an independent group performing a full spectrum engagement, targeting the organization as a whole. And the goal of the assessment is to improve overall cyber resilience by focusing on multiple security domains, meaning people, process, and technology. Now at Secura, we define the kill chain as follows, meaning we start out with planning, reconnaissance, followed by exploitation and post-exploitation, moving towards the crown jewels. And based on the type of assessment, we can top it off with exfiltration and clean closure. Now, this indicates a linear process, but that's not what it is actually. We'll get into that later because it's a cyclical process. And also important to note, it's not a substitute for security testing, but it's complementary to your already existing security testing scheme. Now, I didn't mention two other essential components within red teaming assessment. It's the white and the blue team. Now, the white team is a team comprised of members of your organization, which serve as a sort of referee to make sure that the red team and the blue team is operating within the given parameters and that we're reaching the effective end goal. And of course, you have the blue team. The blue team are all the defenders from your company, but those not only range from the people involved with the security operations center, but there also can be everyone which is tasked with some form of defense can be included in the blue team. Now, I said it's a full spectrum operation. Now, what do I mean with that? I've shown you here a few examples of the types of attack that we can perform during a red team assessment. Now, this is just as an example. This is not limiting, just to give you an idea. So on the left, we have the physical access, is we can actually test to name it, the logs of your company, or maybe even copy access cards to gain entrance through your internal perimeter. But we can also perform social engineering attacks with the well-known attacks called phishing. Phishing is predominantly used by attackers, and it has various degrees of success. And most of you know it for getting access to the internal network, but there is also other goals that we can use phishing for, meaning we can use it to gain more information about your organization or to get credentials or whichever sensitive information. Now you also have the option to use rogue devices, as depicted by a USB stick. Many of you might know the rubber ducky or the bash bunny, which can be used to compromise a system by physically inserting the USB stick into the system. But there's also a second option, is that we introduce a rogue device in your internal network and we'll leave it there. Now, by using that device, you might get access to your internal network, or we can program it to perform a certain task repetitively. And last but not least, there's also remote network compromise, meaning we have in the information gathering phase, we have identified the external exposure of your company, the digital external exposure, and we're actually going to attack that. Now, all these activities are being performed for the following goals. So the key results for the organization, in our view, is to train your vendors, really make sure that they are on the top of their abilities, and also identify unknown weaknesses. Next to that, we can test the impact of known vulnerabilities, assess response procedures, and raise overall security awareness. Now, there is also certain risk involved with red teaming, and controlling risks is paramount. So attacks should never influence the business continuity and process safety. Within Secura, we give you the following examples of risks. So there's a potential for damage caused by side effects of the red teaming, or there might be incorrect or no attribution of real attacks, meaning real attacks by active threat actors might be ongoing, and they might be confused with attacks of the red team, which might lead to several situations. And also, employees might feel attacked or misled because they are targeted within this assessment. So as a few mitigations, we would like to highlight the screening of the red team, which is an essential part of the process where the organization can make sure that the members of the red team are up to par. And next to that, there's a clear coordination between teams. That doesn't mean that the red team is going to directly talk to the blue team. That's not what we mean, but it's that the white team should be in clear control, and the red team should effectively tell what they're going to perform, and the blue team should be kept in the loop for certain events. Now, there's also clear rules of engagements. So at Secura, for instance, we're not going to mimic external suppliers, and also an ethical code of conduct, meaning we're not going to invade personal space of employees. And there's also the possibilities to switch to an acceptance environment. Next, my colleague Ben is going to talk about the threat landscape.
Thank you very much, Edwin. So in a red teaming assessment, we want to simulate a real attacker. But how do you know what is a real attacker against your type of company? And that's why we need the so-called threat landscape. The threat landscape for a lot of different sectors is quite different. So for this webinar, we took one example, which is a threat landscape for energy production and transmission. And we give you some examples of some threat actors that might be active in there and what their motivations might be. So most of these are probably familiar to you, but these are the most commonly attributed threat actors and their motivations. So state-sponsored, where one country wants to gain some advantage over another country, where there's clear geopolitical motivations behind it. Cyber criminals, where the main motive is financial gain. Basically anything where they can make money, and that might actually include your operational technology environment, even though it might not be the most obvious type of group that you might want to protect from. Then insiders are often overlooked, but revenge can be a strong motivation if they left in a really disgruntled way and they have a lot of knowledge about your internal systems, they have access, and so on. And finally, vandals, just people that want to hack your systems because they can and they can get fame from it. And they might not have the biggest impact, but for example, from a public relations perspective, the impact can be quite big. Also, if you are in the critical infra sector in the Netherlands, you might be aware of the newsletter from our National Cybersecurity Center, where they actually talk about the threat actors that are applicable for the different critical infra segments that we have in the Netherlands. Also, what we often see with the more recent attacks against operational technology is that there's usually not one single type of threat actor. For example, it can be the case that a cyber criminal group gains access to the internal systems of an energy generation company, for example, via a mass phishing campaign that they sent. And when they identify, hey, this is interesting access, they might, for example, sell that access to a state-sponsored party, where they then continue an attack on your networks. And to give an example of two pretty well-known real-world attacks against operational technology, those are the Ukraine power grid attacks from 2015 and 2016, usually attributed to the so-called Sandworm group, which is probably a group in Russia, but yeah, attribution on the internet is always hard, so we might never know for sure. And to start off with Black Energy in 2015, that was mainly targeted against distribution substations of different utility companies. And it was the first successful attack against a real-life power grid. They managed to create a blackout for about 230,000 people for 1 to 6 hours. And the attack was quite powerful because after they gained initial access via the IT network, via a public malware framework, they jumped to the OT network. And instead of only figuring out how to disable the power, they went one step further and used something called attack amplification, where they not only performed the attack to disable the power, but also did things like wipe operator systems with a disk wiper, bricking a number of critical systems that are needed for the communication towards the substations, and performing a denial of service against the phone system in order to create as much chaos as they can. And this, for example, required manual reset of breakers at several substations across the country. Then the second attack in Destroyer in 2016 is attributed to the same group. The actual effect of the attack was quite a bit lower. It was a single transmission substation at the north of Kiev, and it blackouted 1/5 of Kiev for about 1 hour. However, it is seen as one of the more advanced cyber-physical attacks because they deployed a malware framework that was specifically created against electrical grids. And a lot of people see this as a possible test to see if the capability that they developed actually works against a real-life target. So next, now that you've know a little bit about the threat landscape that we will take as the context in which to perform a red team, we will talk a bit about the specifics of how does a red team affect your company and what are the things that you might want to learn from it. So with an operation technology, the main goal for your company is not to protect specific assets within the company, but to protect the mission. And the mission can, for example, be produce energy, distribute energy, have a high quality of chemical batches for a pharmaceutical company, or enrich uranium, like in a Stuxnet attack. That's the actual mission that you want to protect. The assets that help you to perform that mission are important. I mean, you don't want to lose certain parts of your network, but that's all second to protecting the mission. So part of your network can drop out. There can be a lot of issues. As long as you can still accomplish your main mission, that is still all right. And that should be the main focus of the defense be. And that is where we see the biggest difference between red teaming in enterprise environments and red teaming in operational technology. So in a classical red teaming against enterprises that we perform, usually the target is access to critical data and systems. So can we access the financial systems? Can we access the systems that would allow us to transfer money? Can we gain access to the blueprints of your most critical technology? That would be for enterprises. With an operation technology, that stuff is still interesting for an attacker, especially in, for example, for cyber espionage. But the main focus is for most attackers to either disrupt, degrade, or destroy the actual mission of the target via cyber attacks. And those are the attacks where attacks via cyber means has an effect on the real world, like we've seen with the blackout attacks in Ukraine. So how to actually do it? When we take a look at the well-known cyber attacks that happened over the last years, they can be a bit simplified to 3 steps that can be performed either by one team or by different teams. Initially, what often happens is the directed collection operation. So in order to perform a real-world attack, the attacker actually needs to know what do we want to do and how do we want to do it. So they need as much information about your company as they can, either from the outside or from the inside. So directed collection, for example, includes OSINT information gathering. They might want to have initial access to your company, for example, via phishing, and then enumerate as much information on the internal network as they can. And for example, already find access to the operational technology domain within your company. Then after that is achieved, and I mean directed collection, for example, is often achieved via a cyber criminal group instead of a state-sponsored actor. It moves towards strategic access. So, okay, now you already know a lot about the target. You have an initial access, but performing the capability to, creating the capability to perform a physical attack might take a lot of time. So that's why strategic access is important, where they make sure that they have multiple redundant ways to access your systems over a long period of time. And once they have that, they might again move the capability to a different team to develop so-called non-kinetic computer network attacks. And those are the actual attacks where they can basically press a button and have real-world consequences. Yeah, and to give you an example about different phases, what happened in real life. For example, for directed collection operations that linked a lot to, for example, the Dragonfly 2.0 campaign. They were specifically looking for example, network and organizational designs, equipment models, wiring diagrams, panel layouts, and HMI screenshots like you see here. So all the stuff that they would need to know how your OT network is actually functioning. For strategic access, it's often called, for example, preparing the battlefield or defending forward. It's mainly about gaining the access and maybe even showing that you have that access. And you might wonder, why do you want to show that you have that access without actually developing capabilities to affect the real world? There are a few cases where there might be a retaliation in cyberspace. For example, your country might be sanctioned and you want to show that you can be inside critical infrastructure of another country that actually issued the sanctions. Or for example, deterrence like, hey, if you might want to attack us in the future, or attack our companies, we can retaliate because we have this level of access inside companies in your country. And you might wonder, the Netherlands is quite a small country, is it really that important? But it actually is, because the Netherlands is quite an important player at some geopolitical alliances. We have some central hubs, for example, for energy distribution throughout Europe. And also the Netherlands was a few times in the news over the last years, for example, that hackers of the Dutch government were inside a Russian hacking operation, or that allegedly Dutch operatives helped to actually get malware into the Iranian uranium enrichment facility for the Stuxnet attack. So yeah, Netherlands is quite prevalent within the world and might be an actual target. And finally, the non-kinetic computer network attacks. Basically, all of the publicly known attacks of this form happened over the last 5 years. And so far, there's not a clear geopolitical or financial motivation behind them, but it seems mostly to be experimentation, like, hey, how to actually perform these attacks, and some strategic messaging, again, like to show, hey, we can perform these attacks. Well, that's what we see in real life from real attackers. And now it's the job of the red team to actually emulate these attacks and to emulate these attacks and help your company to actually defend against them. So for the first phase, the directed collection operations, in our approach, this usually first targets the IT network in order to then jump to the OT network. And that is what we see mainly with the real-life attacks, like the Ukrainian power grid attacks. And these are the pretty usual red teaming steps, with the physical access, phishing, network penetration, and gathering as much open source information about your company as we can find. Then in the next phase, the strategic access. The steps for this phase will be determined depending on what was found during the directed collections. For example, if you want to attack the central OT components, you actually need to gain access to it. And we might identify a number of different ways to actually obtain that level of access. For example, you might have field stations that have a connection to your central OT component, but those field stations might not be physically protected well enough like your central network operations center is. Or to infiltrate in the attack chain, as long as that is part of the scope, and then gain access to the OT systems. That is half of the strategic access, and the other half is to actually obtain persistent access to the IT and OT networks to show that an attacker could be in your network over longer periods of time without being detected, so that they can actually develop capabilities for non-kinetic computer network attacks. And then finally, the non-kinetic CNA attacks. It's quite a long word to say all the time, but Secura will attempt to perform an attack that causes a high impact event in a simulated environment. And the simulated environment is of course critical because, as we said earlier, process continuity and process safety is paramount, and we would never want to actually create such an event in a real life environment. And these events could, for example, be spoil a chemical batch of pharmaceutical products, or turn off the power at a certain region at a certain point of time of the attacker's choosing. And you might wonder, yeah, for red team assessment, where it is all about performing a real life attack, how can you do it in a simulated environment? But that is because towards the end of a red teaming assessment in OT, it in our experience usually moves towards more of a purple teaming assessment, where there's a combination of red team and blue team, but we'll get to that a bit later. So just to reiterate, the managing risk of red teaming in OT is paramount with everything you do. And for that, the red team actually needs a lot of process comprehension and knowledge about the target company, for example, via directed collection. So you need to know what the crown jewels are, so the mission of the target and how to affect it. You need to understand the OT technology stack, because only if you understand the technology, you know how to affect it. And you know how to achieve the impact that you actually want to have. And on the risk control side, everything we do needs to make sure that we continue business continuity and process safety. And that is why there's a tight coordination between the red team, the white team, and why we have our strict rules of engagement and our code of conduct. And the other mentioned before, you might have heard of purple teaming before, and that is usually what is meant with a coordination between the red team, the offense, and the blue team, the defense. Well, at the start of the red teaming assessment in OT, it usually starts with a real red team without the defenders actually knowing what's happening. But once you move toward the actual OT networks and towards performing attacks on them, you don't want to create any additional risk. And that is when there's more and more integration between the red team and the blue team. And so, for example, the red team wants to perform an attack. They notify the blue team, they see if this is possible, or if not, they make sure together that there's a realistic test environment where the attack might actually be performed. So that was a bit to give you the context of how red team or purple team can be performed in OT environments. And I will now pass it again back to Edwin, and he will talk a bit about how to actually measure if your company is ready to handle these real-world attacks.
Well, how to measure these real-world attack readiness and prepare effectively. We at Secura use the MITRE, ATT&CK matrices. So MITRE is an organization which has mapped the TTPs of real APTs on their ATT&CK matrices, meaning, so if you look at the different phases, we have reconnaissance, weaponize, delivery, exploit, control, execute, and maintain. It's a natural attack flow, where in the first stages we use the pre-ATT&CK, And from delivery on out, we use the ATT&CK Enterprise or the ATT&CK ICS. Now, the Enterprise is mainly focused on the IT environment, and the ICS is specifically designed by experts to fit for the OT environment. That being said, if we go to the next slide. Here you can see an example of one of the matrices of MITRE. So if we follow from the top left to the top right, we have initial access, execution, persistence, privilege escalation, and so forth, meaning this is a mapping of an attack flow that can be followed. And it's never going to be a checklist. What do I mean with this? Now you see a few highlighted TTPs. So what it means is if we are going to emulate an ATP like Sandworm, then certain techniques will actually come up as being that's what they employ. And within these tactics, there are certain techniques defined that they will use to actually obtain that the goal of the tactic. Now, you might say, okay, at some point you have a high impact event on the top right of the flow. So at the latter parts of the attack flow, you have a high impact event. Now, it might be very cumbersome, and it might cost a lot of resources to actually make sure that that is secured properly, so the risks were mitigated. One of the possibilities might be to solve these risks, to mitigate them effectively, is to follow the attack path back to the left and to see if we, and at certain points, can make critical attacks, if we can mitigate them, and thereby also in some form get the same effect. So it's not a substitute, but it's a way to effectively employ defense in depth tactics. That being said, this concludes our webinar about red teaming in OT. We hope to have given you insight in how to simulate and prepare for real-world attacks against your critical environment in a safe manner. And now we will continue with a small Q&A session. So just give me a minute to look at the questions that have been posed. Yes, I see quite some interesting questions. So first off, I would like to thank you for the questions. Ben, I will give this over to you. So okay. How to make sure not to interfere with operational process safety, how to effectively not break stuff. Thank you.
Yeah, so as we mentioned a few times, that is besides the learning aspect for the target company, that's the main focus. Like the testing the security is important, but not in such a way that you introduce additional vulnerabilities to the target network. And that is why towards the end of the assessment, when it's more and more of a attack against the actual OT infrastructure, collaboration between the red team and the white team at least, but preferably the red team and the blue team in the end, has a lot of added value. For example, you identified certain PLCs in the OT environment that you could access. Then you might choose the approach that, okay, we're not going to actually affect that PLC in a real environment, but switch to a lab environment or an acceptance environment where we can perform the same attack. We can see the result without real life consequences. And then we see whether an attacker could actually do the attack after gaining the access that they had before. That is one part of it. And yeah, I lost my train of thought for a second. Sorry about that.
No worries, Ben. Just I have another question. So what if the red team gets stuck? You mentioned there is a process with several phases. So what if the red team in the exploitation phase gets stuck? Yes, that's an interesting question. So it might be that we come up against very effective defense measures, which is of course an observation in and of itself. So the red team is not only trying to identify which flaws that you have, it's also about going through the motions and seeing how effective attacks are. Meaning that, for instance, if Secura would have a 0 day, which we could use against your organization and thereby reach the crown jewels and have a good effect on the stated goals. But then again, if the blue team did not pick it up or whatever because it's such an advanced exploit, then that degrades the effectiveness of the overall assessment. So we always have to look at what are we trying to achieve, and real world attackers also make mistakes. That's one of the key things that they all have in common. So what we try to do is during all the different phases of the assessment, we'll spread breadcrumbs, so to speak, to make sure that the defenders can pick up on what we are doing. But then again, if the red team actually gets stuck and we're not able to move forward, then we're going to make an assessment with the white team in how likely is it that an attacker having more time, more resources would be able to overcome the boundaries that we see or that affect us. Then we can make two decisions. One is the decision might be, okay, this is not a valid attack path, and we've sufficiently proven that we do not need to continue in these kind of scenarios, and that's fine. But also it can be, we can assess that there might be a possibility that an attacker actually would be able to achieve this given more time, more resources, as I said. So then we can have a situation where the white team performs us with a so-called leg up, meaning we sort of, so to say, we make a magic move to a next stage in the attack phase, and we pick up the attack from that point of view. Okay. So
I got my train of thought again about the safety of the operation.
Great.
So the other part that I wanted to mention was that we mentioned that we have our code of conduct and our rules of engagement. But it's not only that we have generic rules of engagement of how to perform this, but during the first phases of how to plan the assessment, we will actually create specific rules of engagement for specific network segments or specific segments of your OT environment. So we have clear what can the red team do within specific segments of your network, and what attacks are they allowed to perform. That way we know beforehand what will the risk be for the target environment and what will be safe to execute.
All right. Now, next question is, can you guys mimic specific attacks, TTPs, from the MITRE framework? And how do you assess which attacks are relevant? Yes, so to answer that question, I would say I summarize it as, how do we actually define which TTPs that we are going to simulate? So how do we define which threat actors that we're actually going to simulate? Well, that all depends on the needs of the organization. So in the planning and preparation phase, we'll do several workshops to identify which types of attackers that we need to actually mimic. So are we going to focus on criminal hackers, or are we going to focus on hacktivists, or maybe include even nation state actors? And it all depends on the threat profile that your organization has. So there might also be some research done within your company, and we can include that for sure in the workshops. But also from our expertise, we'll try to determine which threat actors would be applicable. Because you can imagine mimicking nation state actors is a totally ballpark than mimicking hacktivists. Okay, so also next question. You mentioned some IT components. Is there also a possibility to directly focus on OT? So Ben, I would like to.
Yeah, sure. So yes, there are usually IT components within this type of red teaming assessment, because you want to mimic a real life attacker. And what we see in practice is that they usually initially go via the IT components. But depending on what you want to learn from these assessments, budget reasons, etc., it might definitely be possible to only focus on the OT side of things. That might mean that, for example, the red team gets a leg up where they start with access inside of the OT environment, for example, without first having to find all the information of how to actually gain access to there.
Okay, thanks, Ben. Next question. Have you encountered cases where you performed a red teaming mission and found out that APTs or hackers are already inside? Okay, that's an interesting question. Ben, would you like to take that one?
Personally, I have not seen that during red teaming assessments, but we do encounter that sometimes during more regular internal pen tests, where we are on the internal network of a company and we assess the security over there. And that's of course always a part of a red teaming assessment as well, where you're on the internal network and you try to find pathways towards the crown jewels that you want to find. And yes, and there we sometimes encountered indicators of compromise, that somebody might have already escalated the privileges or exploited a machine before.
All right, thank you, Ben. Now, next question is, how does red teaming in OT link to the NIST directive? Well, we can be pretty concise about that. This NIST requests companies to take appropriate and proportional measures regarding OT security. And this is the way to measure how the state of security, cyber resilience is actually included. And next question is, I'm a big believer in red teaming. My question is, if I have an air-gapped network with military-grade physical security, I know that red teaming exercises will add value, but what and how? Okay, that's quite a challenging question, so thank you for that one. But let's first focus on the initial statement. So it says, I have a confirmed air-gapped network with military-grade physical security. That means that you're already really focused on which areas that you have actually secured. So, and by red teaming, what we do is we take a step back and we target, as I said, the organization as a whole. And by targeting the organization as a whole, what we try to do is come up with from our experience and our expertise, come up with new threats that you haven't thought about and you haven't secured yourself for. So that's one of the values that I would say is giving an objective, clear look of experts who are able to highlight new issues that you might not have ever thought about and might not know you need to secure yourself for. And also, it's a confirmed air gap. I will not go into if I believe in the in the correct air gap, but it might be that we as a red team, you can hit a bump. Like, okay, you have found out that it's air gapped and there is no way around it. It might be, but yeah, then still. That's also in previous attacks, they also had air gaps included, and there were still ways to bypass it, either by malicious insiders or various types of different attacks. So I think in that case, a switch of perspective and then proceeding forward might give you new and relevant insights in how to protect your environment effectively with more defense in-depth measures.
And if I can add to that, so it sounds like you have quite a mature security posture in that way. And those are the cases where the red team might be extra efficient, because there might be some so-called unknown unknowns, the things you don't know that you don't know, and the things that you don't know that you should protect yourself against. And yeah, then the red team takes a very different perspective than from what you see yourself from your company. And we will try to find other ways to gain access to those networks anyways. For example, even though your network might be completely air-gapped, do people take workstations for the OT networks outside of the building, and can they be infected somewhere where there's no military-grade security? As one example of how we could try to still gain access anyways.
Yeah. Thanks, Ben. So next question is, how long do these red teaming engagements actually last? And do you often start in IT or in the OT domain? Now, first answer the last part of the question. It depends on what the company needs. So if, for instance, there already has been a red teaming engagement specifically focusing on IT within the last couple of months or within a reasonable time frame, then it might not make sense to start out there again. So then we would for sure focus on OT environments. But the real world attackers, they also most of the time start out with a initial foothold in the IT environment, and from there on out move to the OT environment. So it all depends on what the company needs. And also for the time frame of an OT red teaming assessment, we usually say, okay, it will take at least 12 weeks. Now, does that mean that you have to? Does that mean that the red team is fully on the job for 12 weeks at a time? No, because some attacks need to linger, need to take effect. So, for instance, phishing and these types of attack, you need to send them out and then wait for a response. But generally speaking, if you look at the time frame that we include is 12 weeks, and we see that there is generally an overrun of a few weeks. Now, that being said, there might also be some high impact event at your company for whatever reason, and then we should for sure get in touch with each other about actually halting the red team engagement at that point, because we are hurting the organization more than you're actually benefiting. But those cases might come up too as well. And let's see. Give me a second. Okay, so there's a question about how do you actually start these kind of projects? They feel quite daunting. It's large engagements. So how do you start such a big project? Do you offer kind of any phased approach so we can easily start without actually committing to the full project? Yes, for sure. So as I've showed in the beginning of the webinar, at Secura we use a kill chain, and we start out with planning and preparation. And in that planning and preparation phase, we'll get in touch with each other, make sure that we are on the right track of what you actually request from us and what we are going to do for you. And there we are going to define the goals, we're going to define crown jewels, but we're also going to define a planning. And it might be we're also going to launch workshops. In these workshops, Ben, can you tell a little about these workshops?
Yeah, sure. So what we've done in the past is that we create a workshop for your organization with the prospective white team, so the people who are actually aware of the red teaming assessment. And in that workshop, we figure out together what are the crown jewels that you want to protect, what are some high-level scenarios that you would see that are realistic, together with our experience in that case, of course. And from that workshop, we create an actual plan of approach, which includes the high-level phasing of how we would perform the red teaming assessment, the high-level scenarios, etc. And from that document, we can have, of course, more discussions about, hey, how to actually perform it, what will be the rules of engagement, and also align, of course, with you and the budget, because if you might want to perform all scenarios, it might take a more budget than without.
Yeah, so for sure we can split these activities up, where we first do a planning and preparation phase, which we align, and we are going to talk about budgets, etc. But then that can be separate from the actual engagement. And what we at Secura also recommend is that red teaming engagement is not something that you do once and then you're good to go. No, it should be an essential part of your security scheme, where you might go for a multi-year approach, where you do a red teaming engagement for every year, and you could focus on the first year, you could focus on the first part. Sorry, Ben, can you? I lost the train of the first collecting information.
Yeah, the directed collection.
Exactly, and then you could do the second engagement. You could do it in the second year, and so forth and so forth. Now I think we have time for one more question. And it is, do you only focus on red teaming activity, or do you provide support in implementing the corrective controls? Well, that's a good question. We at Secura, we believe in the cooperation between the red and the blue team, meaning it's not about we only perform the attacks and that's it. So blue team evaluations are an essential part of the learning process, meaning we're going to go over the events with the blue team. If possible, we try to determine how to correctively make adjustments within the solutions that you already have in place, to effectively find out what we can do to mitigate risks. And there is also for sure then the possibility to switch into a purple team mode, where we then are going to replay these attacks again and to see if the mitigations are actually working. So yeah, it's not only about the attacking, it's for sure the essential part of it is also the part where we cooperate with the blue team and make sure that correct mitigations are in place. So yeah. I see there are a few more questions, but we're running out of time. So thank you. We'll post them on our website, including all the questions that have been included so far. And first off, I would like to thank you for all the questions.
From me as well, thank you all for attending and the great questions. The interactivity always helps with these webinars. So yeah, As you see on the screen, we have a next webinar coming up that might be interesting to you, and it's about the ISO and UN ECE standards within automotive, and that's on June 25th. Hope to see you then.
Okay, thanks everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you. Have a good day.